Hi, my name's Trickey, and it's so great that you're able to be here today as we think about being fruitful for Jesus in the everyday and why that matters to us as evangelists. I currently work for the London Institute for Contemporary Christianity, or LICC, and we spend a lot of our time helping church leaders, churches and individuals to stop and think about fruitfulness. Together with Annette Lenchbury, we'll be helping you to think about how evangelism, integrated into a life of discipleship and fruitfulness, helps us to be better and richer as evangelists. I'm really sorry not to be with you live tonight. Our third little one was due at the end of January, and so my parts are all pre-recorded. Annette will be with you live for Q&A at various points during this greenhouse. She's wonderful. She's our emerging generations champion and is absolutely passionate about seeing women thrive in all that they do, raising up young women as fruitful disciples of Jesus. I want to begin tonight by introducing myself and my story a little bit, because I hope that as I tell you a little bit about me, you'll get a sense of why I think this matters so much to us as evangelists. Some of you will know parts of this story, so please bear with me if this is old news. After uni, I bumbled around a bit, I think feeling quite unsure of what God was calling me to do. I worked for a bit in London in marketing, and then found myself quite surprisingly back at university studying theology at Oxford at Wycliffe Hall. It was beautiful, that setting surrounded by great minds, passionate Christians, and stunning architecture. And while I was there, I was part of a whole series of mission trips and encouraged by some really godly people, men and women. My passion for evangelism and for sharing the gospel in a structured sense grew and grew as I saw people coming to know Jesus for the first time. It was beautiful. I've been part of university missions nearly every year since, and there's something about it that's really precious. But college also had a fair few challenges. The culture of the college was at times awful, and the women got a pretty raw deal. Despite that, some great friendships came out of it, and I personally fell more and more in love with Jesus as I saw not only who he was in history, but who he was in my life. Fast forward a few years and another turn at theological college, I'm ordained in the Church of England, working for a great faithful church, and married to the lovely Josh. Baby number one comes along, and instead of being caught up in the hustle and bustle and busyness of public ministry, I find myself at home, day after day after day, often alone for long sections of time. It was a beautiful time, but also a time of having to examine myself and my faith closely. I was no longer, at least for a while, leading a ministry where I could measure success by growth or by the number of people who had come to know Jesus. Often success became getting both of us dressed and out of the house, staying on top of the chaos and the chores, keeping everyone fed. I had to rethink my criteria for success. I had to lean deep into the knowledge that I am made in the image of a wonderful God, and I'm valuable not because of what I do, but because of him and because of his love for me. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not that I didn't know that. It's more that something in this moment led me to being stripped back and seeking God in a new way, to seeing his calling afresh, to having to re-examine what a fruitful life looked like. And I remember when I was at Wycliffe, sat in a lecture, a brilliant lecture on apologetics by Amy or Ewing, and I'm sure the whole thing was great, but I have one takeaway, and it was this: remembering her talking about wiping. She said how as a mum there's a lot of wiping, and you can either get frustrated by it or turn it to prayer. And for me as a mum in that moment in life, it was so refreshing. It didn't stop me being tired, sometimes lonely, or never getting to drink a hot cup of tea, but it did something transformational. It turned something that is a never-ending, well, at least this side of heaven, chore into a spiritual discipline. A place even for a moment where I could see that I was joining God in his work, making a place where my family could thrive. And it's grown from there as I bring more and more of my normal, non-churchy life into focus as part of my discipleship. There's a definition of disciple we use at LICC. A disciple is simply someone who is learning to live the way of Jesus in their context at this moment. I'll say that again. A disciple is simply someone who is learning to live the way of Jesus in their context at this moment. We're learning, we're apprentices of the way of Jesus in our contexts. In our lifetime, the context and the moments that we find ourselves in are so many and varied. But I don't think that disciples are primarily formed in those churchy places on retreats and courses. They're formed in the situations that demand wisdom, perseverance or courage. They're formed on the anvil of everyday life, learning the way of Jesus on the tennis court at the side of one of those kids' parties in the middle of a difficult period at work, going through family changes, or when work just doesn't work out. These are the contexts where we learn to live the way of Jesus. And we are all learning all the time, growing, changing, getting better at some things, maybe worse at others. As I look back on my work and ministry, there are plenty of things I would do differently now with the wisdom of hindsight. Lots of things that I messed up, or honestly simply mishandled. And as I've learnt to follow Jesus in different contexts, I hope I've become a wiser follower. A better disciple, hopefully, growing fruitfully as I follow Jesus. And this matters for lots of reasons. It matters because life's a peach, not an orange. What do I mean by this? It's not a bunch of different segments that function independently, as if my work, my home, my evangelism, my spiritual life and all those other bits sit separately, as if I can invest in one and let the other shrivel up without too much concern. It's like a peach, designed to grow as one piece around the core, the pip, that is Jesus. Growing as fruitful disciples matters because it stops us from getting really discouraged or sometimes too self-confident. Let me explain. In the early days of LICC, we did a lot of work exploring what people thought made them fruitful disciples. The measure most of them used was evangelistic conversations. But the problem was that most Christians don't find themselves in evangelistic conversations very often. In fact, most people spend a large amount of their lives surrounded by people who aren't Christians, but not really able to talk about Jesus openly, not able to, as we might say, share the gospel in the places that we work, live, study and play. And so at LICC we've adopted the language of Frontlines for those places. The places where we are, if you like, on the front line of the kingdom, on the mission field. The places where we go to every day into God's world to be his people. Just think for a minute about where you live. Who's around you? How do you interact with them? Where are the doors open to building friendship? You might want to just pause and jot down a name or two to come back to later. Where do you work? Paid or unpaid, all of us work in some way. We're joining with God in his creation plan of making something new. Or maybe in his salvation plan of bringing back order to chaos, restoring things to how they should be. And this work that we do can be as simple as making beans on toast and washing up at the end, or as significant as creating beautiful art, building a significant business, or saving a life in a hospital. The value of work is intrinsic. It's God-given, part of our calling as his people. So who's around you when you work? Who do you naturally interact with as part of your working rhythm? Let me tell you about one gorgeous girl I had coffee with recently. She'd recently graduated and was off to work in a prison. She was really excited, very unusual and wonderful, feeling called. But actually, when we talked, quite sad that she wouldn't be able to be reliably on rotas at church. She felt like she was letting people down. I was shocked. Here's someone who's going where none of the rest of us can, where no one inside the prison should be coming out to our church services. And somehow she didn't see that God's calling was no mistake. And as we talked, I shared about how precious the work she is called to is. And I could kind of see a light come on as she realised that her calling to this place as a woman of God was precious and extraordinary. And we together trusted that God would bring someone else to fill in those gaps in the rotas. Studying. If you study, what does that look like for you? Who's teaching you? Who's learning alongside you? What does that frontline look like? I've found studying, and I've done quite a lot of it, to be a brilliant place for building friendships. And I'm so grateful for all those people who've helped me when I'm struggling, who've laughed and cried and studied late into the night for a deadline with me. I've also found it to be a place where people are really open to talking about what's in their minds, what they think and what they believe. And remarkably sometimes open to prayer before an exam. My friends at school would often come find me to pray for them before exams. They'd never pray at other times, of course, but exams were different. And then where do we play? Something that is so neglected, but often a place where we can be so fruitful for Jesus. A place where we have great connections with people as we craft or sweat or laugh with others. As we lean into our God-given need for rest and restoration. In our marriage, Josh and I talk about two kinds of rest. The rest that is just a break from the busyness, the kind of, I need to sit still. And the kind of resting that restores, that gives life, that fills us. So who's around you when you play? Friends, people running a venue, staff in a cafe. Again, you might want to take a moment and think about some names. You see, you might be the only Christian called into these places, into these clubs and communities. And so tonight I'm hoping to provoke you to think, to imagine, what does it look like to be fruitful in these places? To think intentionally about these people and these front lines, and to imagine what it would look like if a few more people there came to know Jesus, or if the culture looked a bit more like the culture of heaven. If we go back to the idea that only certain kinds of fruitfulness matter, we also run the risk of starting to think that only certain types of people matter. So evangelists and church leaders are the really valuable Christians, maybe with doctors and teachers as well. And the rest of us are just here as supporters, providing money from our wages and joining in with the missionary initiatives of the church-based workers who really do have the best ideas. The problem is, if we believe this, we won't value our work or our streets, and we'll rush out of them to get to the next church-based activity or evangelistic meeting on the calendar, neglecting these front lines because we somehow, whether we know it or not, don't really believe that they matter. We forget that God cares greatly for our offices, our teams, our friends and our neighbours. And I think, particularly among us evangelists, there's a chance that we miss the people who are right in front of us. We can run the risk of prioritising speaking events over our neighbours, because however much we might try and deny it, there's kind of a sense that numbers are the things that really matter, that the size of the audience is the most important thing, and that somehow being a big stage evangelist, a known name, is more important than being a witness, living fruitfully right where we are. I think if I was talking about my ministry, I'd probably categorise myself as quite a small-scale evangelist. Like, I'm an okay communicator, maybe a good communicator. But most of the people that I know have come to Jesus slowly after years of friendship. When I look at my friends, some of my dearest friends have never led anyone to Jesus. Does that make me, who's led a handful, more fruitful than they are? But I look at them, they are culture shapers, prayer warriors, incredible encouragers, justice bringers. Are they failing to be fruitful? I don't think that for a minute. Now, I've been part of Passion for Evangelism since the early days, and I love the creativity and variety that spills out of this community. I think you're amazing, and I love how we seek to follow Jesus together in a way that exposes his creativity and his love. It's a joy and an honour to be part of this group of women who are seeking to share the gospel in all kinds of ways and in all kinds of places. I wish I'd known you all in my early days of ministry when I was so often asked, do you know any other female speakers or evangelists we could invite? And I'm so thrilled that now I can just point to all of you and say, look, here's a fantastic group of women. For me, one of the great joys of being a Christian is realising that God chooses to work through each and every one of us, wherever we are, at home or on a platform or somewhere in between. And I think one of the tricky things that we all kind of wrestle with in our faith is learning how to spot God at work. So often we just don't have the words, the tools or the means to see how we are already being fruitful for Christ in all of our places that we find ourselves. And so what we've tried to do here at LICC is to develop a bit of a framework to help us see how God is already working through us and through those we know. And to go further than that, help us to inspire our imaginations for how he might continue to do that in the future. I think that's really exciting. So this framework has 6 facets and they all begin with the letter M. And as you listen to these, can I invite you to ask yourself a simple question? This may be a bit countercultural or a bit uncomfortable for you, but I'd love you to consider, which one of these am I really good at? There might even be more than one. And that's the fun of the 6 M's. They're an encouragement, a lens through which to see how God is already working in us, through you and through me, in our daily lives, and through the others around us in theirs. Our fruitfulness, after all, is rooted in Christ, and it's already there. These M's are just an expression of that. So the first one is this: modelling godly character. Maybe it's displaying self-control by keeping a cool head when a colleague or someone you're serving is provoking you. Maybe it looks like promoting peace by mediating an argument between 2 businesses. Maybe it's bringing joy by encouraging those around you. Whatever we do, wherever we are either reflecting God's character or we're not. A bit awkward. So with this M, we're reminding ourselves that in the start, in our everyday, God forms our character to be like Jesus, so we can better reflect Jesus' character to those around us. And as that happens, we become bearers of the fruit of the Holy Spirit. Isn't that brilliant? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. All those things we see in action when we think about this 6M. So when you think about who you see modelling godly character, who springs to mind first? Note that name down. How do you model godly character? Is this something you're good at? No guilt. It's just good to notice in ourselves how we're feeling about these things as we go along. The second M is making good work. Sometimes, I don't know about you, but our everyday tasks can seem a bit meaningless or just like means to an end. But making good work means realising that everything we do is to and for the glory of God. After all, that's what we're instructed to do in Colossians 3:23-25. Independent of anyone else, we can do everything, the fun, the interesting, the big, the small, the mundane, and the just plain boring, for the glory of God, to impact on people and on the world he created, and redeems with joy, for it is the Lord Christ we're serving. For me, one of the most inspiring workers I spend a lot of time with is my mum. She's a psychiatrist, which makes some people run away in fear. And I remember school friends being worried that she could probably read their mind from a distance. What I love most about her work is how she cares. She doesn't see her patients as problems, and some of them are in very, very challenging situations. But when she speaks about them, anonymised of course, I think they'd actually quite like to hear what she has to say. She speaks with so much love and compassion about the people she serves. She goes above and beyond to make hard situations better. I'm not impressed because she does this super influential job, but because she works hard with love and care as they're working for the Lord, looking after people who are in really hopeless situations. And she doesn't criticise them, even on hard days when she's had to call the police for her own safety or things have gone a bit wrong. And that approach she has to her paid work spills over into what she does in her unpaid work, as she gives up her time to care for grandchildren or elderly parents or serve at church. It's consistent with how she cared for us when she was a full-time stay-at-home mum. She knows that her work is a God-given calling. So what does your work look like? What does your paid work and your unpaid work, your public and your private work look like? And do you do it for the glory of God? And just remembering that for women, particularly, work looks like all kinds of different things. So I want to ask you, who around you inspires you with their attitude to work? Are you someone who makes good work, or is there somewhere where you want to grow? Thirdly, the third M, ministering grace and love. Well, where to begin? It's the friend who comes to visit you in the hospital when they're under pressure. It's in my colleagues who gently bear with me when I'm running behind. It's in my friend the greengrocer who just slips a little bit extra from his shop into the basket of someone he knows who is out of work. He is the boss, so it's okay. It's the teacher who recognises that kid in her class is having a tough time at home and goes the extra mile. It's the mum who stops to hear what's really going on behind the grumpiness of a 5-year-old. It's the people of God echoing the work of Jesus as they bind up the brokenhearted and love the ones who seem unlovable, opening their homes and their purses and their lives to others who may give them nothing in return, walking out the gospel one encounter at a time. And we see it time and time again in the church, in the early church, in Acts, and in the church today, as it cares for the widows and the orphans, for the sick and the poor. I see it in my friend Amy, who's so good at listening when I'm having a tough time. She hears my pain and speaks love to me. I've lost count of the number of times she's WhatsApped me just to say hi or to check in, to send love. She brings plenty of challenge too and always keeps me real, inspires me to keep growing. And when we had tiny kids and were basically tied to the house most evenings, she and her husband used to bring us dinner every Monday. It was really precious to spend a bit of time together, but what an act of love and grace for two exhausted parents. So who do you know who ministers grace and love? Again, jot their name down for later. And then I want to ask you, how do you do this? Would you say it's something you're good at? If you're naturally uncomfortable about acknowledging what you are good at, this is a moment to pause and think, what would others say about you with regard to these first 3 M's we've covered so far? Because you see, sometimes the things that we are best at come really naturally to us, and so we just don't see how significant they can be, and it takes others to call them out. Fourthly, moulding culture. Culture can be thought of as the way we just do things around here, and moulding it makes small changes to dynamically express Christian values. So it's the person who counters the culture of blame to the corporate world by admitting they've made a mistake, and also offering forgiveness to those who slip up. It's quenching gossip with a positive word about the person who is always the butt of the jokes or subject of conversation. It's about championing trust and honesty in our departments, nurturing safe spaces in our homes. When you look at the women of the Bible, I'm struck by how many of them are real culture shapers. Despite living in a culture where their voice was not as powerful as a man's, they are ones who build homes, the ones who welcome Jesus with food and take time to give him attention. Take Mary and Martha and their most famous story in Luke 10:38 and onwards, which most of us know because Mary doesn't help. But it begins with the phrase, a woman named Martha opened up her home to Jesus. She chooses to open the door and to offer hospitality. I love that this story comes straight on the back of the Good Samaritan, where the hospitality of a stranger to someone in need is held up as an example to be emulated. Martha's culture of hospitality continues as her faith grows. She goes out to meet Jesus when her brother Lazarus dies. And we see after Lazarus' resurrection, she continues to serve as the hostess when Jesus comes for the celebration feast. She creates spaces in which people can meet and talk and celebrate. So who do you know who's great at moulding culture? Is this something you do? Maybe naturally, or something you're working on? How do you shape culture? Do you do it with small shifts or big changes? Fifth, mouthpiece for truth and justice. Whether we realise it or not, this is something we get to do every single day. And again, it can be as simple as refusing to engage in gossip at the school gate, or speaking up for a colleague who's been overlooked. It could be bigger, ruling our patch, the area of responsibility that God has given us, and ruling it well. Making sure that other people get the credit they deserve when we could have taken it for ourselves. Big or small, being a mouthpiece for truth and justice looks like standing up, often at personal cost, to promote good, fair and just practices. I've recently been writing on the Book of Esther for a project, and in doing so I've been struck by how often she models this truth and justice aspect of fruitfulness. She speaks truth boldly to King Xerxes, despite knowing it might cost her everything. She seeks justice for the people of God who are being done a great wrong. She challenges the unjust use of power by Haman, the king's advisor, and in doing so she risks setting herself up in conflict with a powerful opponent. How does she do it? She curates a space in which she knows she will be properly heard. She asks people to join her in prayer and fasting, and she makes her case articulately. I like the book because, a bit like my life, it's not all set out for her. She discovers her calling along the way as she seeks to honour God. And with the benefit of hindsight, we can see how he works in her and for her. And whether our call to truth and justice takes on massive battles or just small ones, it's one of the ways that we show how fruitful we are as disciples of Jesus. And trust me, it's one people notice as we lay down our desires and sometimes our own comfort for the good of others. Who do you know who emulates that? Sixth, messengers of the gospel. Well, you all know about this one. In fact, some of you know much more than I do. Sometimes it's about having a public platform, in person or over social media, to share how Jesus has transformed your life and the lives of those around you. I love that through Passion for Evangelism, so many spaces are made for us to do this, to learn alongside others, to encourage one another, to give each other boldness to step out in faith, putting out there something that people might ask about, explore or question. One Christmas, the evangelist Michael Green and his wife Rosemary came up to Newcastle to see their family, and it was snowing, and so Michael, in his 80s, of course, wanted to go sledging. And I spent the whole time wondering how I would explain it to friends that we'd taken Michael sledging and he had ended up in hospital. He was fine, of course, and probably the most fearless of us all. But I was really struck by Rosemary. She's never really been hailed as a great evangelist among the shining lights like Michael and others of his day. But on that day I discovered a hidden dynamite. She got out her knitting, put her slippers on, and proceeded to ask my mum how she'd come to faith. Direct, warm, and impossible to ignore. By the time we got back, my mum had told her whole testimony and had space to ask all kinds of questions. Being a messenger of the gospel can be about that big stage, and it can be about the quiet. We're not there to deliver pre-packaged messages of the gospel and retreat to a safe distance to see what happens. It might simply be bringing a testimony about God's action in your life where it's appropriate to do so. It sometimes just means having an intentionality, a desire to share something of Jesus with those around us when you can, to communicate the message of the gospel. So apart from Nay, obviously, who do you know who's good at this? Are you good at this? I mean, you're one of a bold group of women who've taken on the label of an evangelist. Is this something you would consider yourself good at? Or are you here feeling a bit of an imposter? If you'd put yourself in the second group, please don't. Just being here shows your desire and openness to being fruitful in this way. See, these 6 M's all work together. They're part of our witness to those around us of God's action in our lives. Hearing about a God of love becomes a lot more believable when you've seen the person who's sharing him with you act in a loving way. A God of justice makes sense when you've seen his follower stand up in the face of unfair practices. So this is our challenge to you. Pick on one of those first 5 M's. Modelling godly character, making good work, ministering grace and love, moulding culture, or being a mouthpiece for truth and justice. Take some time to lean into it. Think about it. Pray about it. And we'd love you to communicate what you've learned, how your thinking has changed, and what this characteristic looks like in your life. We'd love you to make a video to submit to the group, and this could be about someone you admire that displays one of the characteristics, or it could be a video of your own journey in growing and understanding some of this characteristic. I'll leave Nay to sort out some of the practical details with you, but let me close with a prayer. Heavenly Father, you made us in your image and you delight in us. You have given us good work to do, places and communities to be in. And so we pray that as we journey together over the next few weeks, that you will work through us. You will inspire us. You will open our eyes to see you at work. And I pray for your blessing on my sisters, that as they think about what it is to follow you and to grow in fruitfulness, they would be filled with your love and inspired by your Spirit. Amen. So that's it from me. You've got Nay and Annette to guide you through the rest of the weeks. I'll be praying for you, and I'm really excited I'll get to watch what you make and what you do. So I really wish you the best. I'll be praying for you, and thank you so much for taking the time this evening. God bless you all and good night.